Miss Marple and the Case of the Amber Brooch. Chapter 1. The Garden Party. The sun glinted cheerfully upon the well-manicured lawns of Little Bindon, a charming village that nestled itself quietly in the folds of the English countryside. From Miss Marple's vantage point, seated comfortably under a striped parasol with a plate of almond cake resting delicately on her lap, the world appeared peaceful, almost tediously so, but, as she often reminded herself, one never truly knew what secrets might lurk beneath even the most placid surfaces. The annual Bindon Summer Fete was in full swing, hosted this year on the grounds of the Grand Cranley Manor, the home of Sir Geoffrey and Lady Clara Cranley, respected stalwarts of village society. The garden was a riot of colour, roses in full bloom, delicate hydrangeas, and the proud, towering foxgloves that seemed to sway knowingly in the light breeze. Stalls lined the paths, offering everything from homemade jams to hand-knitted tea, cosies, and in the distance a string quartet played a polite waltz that lent the air a faintly old-world charm. Miss Marple took a small sip of her tea, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully from one gathering to another. The villagers were out in their finest. Mrs. Winthrop, the vicar's wife, looking harried as usual but determinedly polite. Colonel Faraday, retired and still puffed up with self-importance. Mrs. Alicia Denholm, recently widowed and wearing her grief like a fashionable stole. And, of course, Mr. Leonard Marsh, the new owner of the Bindon Antiques shop, who was causing quite a stir, though no one would admit it outright. It was to Mr. Marsh that much of the quiet attention was directed. And not without reason. Tall and well-dressed, with a way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes, Mr. Marsh had arrived in Little Bindon only 2 months earlier. Yet he had already managed to befriend, or at least charm, half the village. There were rumours, of course. There always were. Some said he was running from debts. Others whispered of a tragic past involving a faithless wife and a duel abroad, though no one could quite say where they'd heard it first. Miss Marple, watching him from across the lawn, noted how deftly he manoeuvred between groups, offering compliments here and a witty remark there, always careful to avoid lingering too long in one place. She had seen his type before. Oh, yes. Just then, a small commotion began near the refreshment table. Lady Clara, resplendent in lavender silk and pearls, was exclaiming in distress, "My brooch! Geoffrey! My amber brooch! It's gone!" There was a ripple of surprise as heads turned toward her. "It was here, not a moment ago. I had it pinned. Oh dear, Geoffrey, it was my mother's." Lady Clara's voice rose in a mixture of outrage and genuine dismay. Sir Geoffrey, his large frame stiff with embarrassment, patted her awkwardly on the shoulder. Now, Clara, are you sure it didn't come loose?" No, it was fastened firmly. Someone must have taken it." A hush fell over the gathering. In a village like Little Bindon, theft was nearly unthinkable. Murmured speculation began at once, and Miss Marple heard Mrs. Banbury, a notorious gossip, whisper sharply to her companion, "Well, it must have been that Mr. Marsh, you know, he's always watching the ladies, and that brooch, why, it would fetch a pretty sum in an antiques shop." Miss Marple set her teacup carefully back on its saucer. From where she sat, in the dappled shade of the parasol, she could see the whole scene. Lady Clara, pale and flustered, Sir Geoffrey muttering to her quietly, Mr. Marsh standing nearby with an expression of polite concern, and the rest of the villagers caught between outrage and prying curiosity. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced once more at the empty space where Lady Clara's amber brooch had sparkled only minutes ago. It was not perhaps a murder, not yet, but Miss Marple had the curious sense, deep in her bones, that something much darker than a simple theft had just begun to stir in the quiet heart of Little Bindon. And, as she reached for another bite of almond cake, she knew that before long there would be a great deal more to uncover. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By the following morning, news of the stolen amber brooch had travelled through Little Bindon with astonishing speed, as news of any scandal tended to do. The village had perfected the art of genteel gossip, wrapped carefully in the guise of concern. At Mrs. Banbury's tea-table, the matter was being thoroughly dissected. "Well," Mrs. Banbury said, leaning forward with a conspiratorial air, "if you ask me, and people do ask me, Miss Simmons, it's no surprise that something like this has happened with that stranger in our midst." She pursed her lips meaningfully. Miss Simmons, a timid woman of indeterminate age, nodded eagerly. "You mean Mr. Marsh?" "Of course, I mean Mr. Marsh." Mrs. Banbury's voice dropped to a whisper, though no one was within earshot. "A man no one really knows. And he's an antique dealer, too. You know what sort of people they attract. Trinkets and treasures, they call them. But they're all just one step from thieves, if you ask me." "But Lady Clara was sure it was there when she arrived," Miss Simmons murmured. Mrs. Banbury gave a sharp nod. "Exactly. And now it's gone. A family heirloom, no less. And there's Mr. Marsh, standing right beside her when it disappeared. Oh, I'd wager he had his eye on it from the moment he saw it. Amber like that. Well, it would fetch quite a sum, wouldn't it?" Meanwhile, at the post office, the discussion was no less animated. "I never liked the look of that brooch," said Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, as she sorted envelopes with quick, precise fingers. "Oh, far too large and showy. But Lady Clara always did like to put on airs." "Oh, but still," said Tom Denby, the young clerk, "it's a shame to lose something her mother gave her." Miss Hartnell replied, "though some might say Lady Clara's more upset over what people think of her now that it's gone, rather than the brooch itself." Tom hesitated. "You don't think—" Miss Hartnell raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I'm not saying she staged it, but it's curious, all the same. Curious timing, what with Sir Geoffrey's financial troubles." Tom blinked. "I didn't know Sir Geoffrey was in trouble." "Well," Miss Hartnell said with a little smirk, "that's what they don't want people to know. But a house, like Cranley Manor, doesn't keep itself, does it? And there have been whispers. Unpaid tradesmen, you know. Some say Sir Geoffrey has been trying to sell off bits of the estate quietly. As the morning wore on, even Reverend Finch, the kindly vicar, found himself unable to avoid the topic as he made his usual calls. "Well, I do hope," he said carefully to Mrs. Winthrop, his wife, as they arranged flowers in the church, "that people don't let this unpleasantness spoil the Fates' good work. The funds for the parish roof, you know." Mrs. Winthrop, a sharp-eyed woman who saw much more than she let on, sniffed. "If you ask me, Leonard Marsh isn't the only one with reason to want that brooch." People forget that Lady Clara has made her share of enemies in this village, and Sir Geoffrey's kindness has limits when it comes to money. The only person in Little Bindon who had not offered an opinion, at least not publicly, was Miss Marple. She sat quietly in her drawing-room that afternoon, knitting with deliberate care. Her maid, Florence, bustling in with the tea-tray, could not resist breaking the silence. "They do say, ma'am, that it was Mr. Marsh what took it," Florence began, setting down the tray. "Do they?" Miss Marple murmured, not looking up. "From her knitting? Yes, ma'am. And some say he's been in prison before, though I couldn't say if that's true. But he is an outsider. And outsiders always bring trouble, don't they?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Florence, you know, I always find it curious how eager people are to believe the worst of those they don't know. But in my experience," she added, her needles clicking softly, "trouble is just as likely, if not more so, to come from those we know all too well." Florence looked puzzled but said nothing, retreating to the kitchen. Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the flowers in her window box. She had lived in Little Bindon long enough to understand that beneath its tranquil surface lay rivalries, jealousies, and secrets that would make a London scandal sheet blush. The disappearance of Lady Clara's amber brooch was troubling, yes, but not perhaps for the reason most people thought. And as the last light of the sun faded over the village rooftops, Miss Marple quietly folded her knitting and reached for her notebook, a small, leather-bound thing in which she occasionally jotted down her observations about human nature. She had a feeling she would be needing it very soon. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The next morning dawned bright and deceptively peaceful. The usual routine of Little Bindon resumed, post delivered, bread fetched, and gardens tended. But beneath the surface, every conversation, every glance seemed charged with speculation. It was after breakfast when Inspector Craddock, summoned from the nearby town of Much Benham, arrived at Cranley Manor. His presence caused a small stir among the villagers, who gathered in twos and threes to watch his car sweep up the drive, whispering behind gloved hands. Miss Marple, for her part, took a slow stroll through the village, nodding politely to everyone, while her keen eyes missed nothing: the hurried closing of curtains, the quiet exchange between Mr. and Mrs. Pettigrew, the local grocer and his wife, as they watched from their shop door. She eventually made her way toward Cranley Manor, stopping to admire the roses at the gate, seemingly engrossed in their bloom. From her vantage point, she could see Lady Clara pacing nervously in the morning-room, and Sir Geoffrey standing rigidly by the fireplace, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Meanwhile, inside the manor, Inspector Craddock had settled into a formal chair, notebook open, facing Lady Clara and Sir Geoffrey. "Now, Lady Clara," Craddock said gently but firmly, "I must ask you to go over everything again, if you please, from the moment you arrived at the fete." Lady Clara wrung her hands, her usually poised manner replaced by visible agitation. "I wore the brooch when I left the house," she began. "I was quite certain of that. It was pinned here." She touched the lace at her collar. "And I distinctly remember adjusting it as I stepped out of the carriage. I wanted to look my best." Sir Geoffrey's expression remained inscrutable, but his jaw tightened. "And when," Craddock asked, Did you first notice it missing? Not until after the flower show prizes had been awarded. I went to join the ladies for tea, and as I sat down, I reached for my handkerchief and realized it was gone. And before that, you had spoken to... Lady Clara's brow furrowed as she recalled. Oh, quite a few people, Inspector. Mrs. Banbury, of course, Miss Simmons, Reverend Finch and his wife, Mr. Marsh. Yes, I spoke to him briefly near the antique display. Craddock made a note. And was anyone unusually close to you? Perhaps close enough to remove the brooch unnoticed? Lady Clara's eyes widened. Well, I didn't think anyone could do such a thing, Inspector. These are respectable people. Craddock's lips twitched into a polite smile. Forgive me, Lady Clara, but I've learned not to take respectability for granted. Now, Sir Geoffrey, might I ask if you noticed anything? Sir Geoffrey, who had been silent thus far, finally spoke in a clipped voice. I did not. And frankly, Inspector, I'm not sure why so much fuss is being made. It's unfortunate, certainly, but perhaps the brooch simply fell off. Lady Clara turned to him, aghast. Geoffrey, it was fastened securely. You know it was. Craddock glanced between them thoughtfully. Very well. I shall need to speak with everyone present yesterday, including Mr. Marsh. As Craddock gathered his things to begin his interviews, Miss Marple, still standing by the garden gate, turned away and made her way back down the lane. She had much to think about. On her way, she paused near the church, where Reverend Finch was tending to the roses with his usual gentle care. Good morning, Miss Marple, he greeted her warmly, wiping his hands on a cloth. Good morning, Reverend, Miss Marple returned pleasantly. Such beautiful roses this year. Yes, indeed. Though I confess, Miss Marple, it's hard to enjoy them when the village is so unsettled. Miss Marple gave a soft smile. Oh, but isn't it curious how quickly people leap to conclusions? Poor Mr. Marsh, for instance. Reverend Finch looked up, surprised. You don't think... I had thought, well, perhaps he's a little mysterious, but I wouldn't accuse the man outright. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Exactly, Reverend. And yet, so many are ready to do just that. I've always found that when something goes missing, one ought to look not only at who could take it, but also who would benefit most. Finch looked thoughtful. Benefit? You mean financially? Miss Marple gave a vague nod. Financially, perhaps, or otherwise. Sometimes people's motives are not so straightforward. As she walked on, she passed Mrs. Banbury's home, where the formidable lady herself was out arranging her garden baskets. Oh, Miss Marple, Mrs. Banbury called. Such a terrible thing, isn't it? Lady Clara is simply beside herself. Miss Marple tilted her head sympathetically. Yes, poor Lady Clara. Though one wonders, Mrs. Banbury, whether she's more upset about the brooch or what its loss might reveal. Mrs. Banbury blinked. Reveal? What do you mean, dear? Oh, nothing, Miss Marple murmured with a smile. Only that sometimes when something is lost, other things, hidden things, come to light. Leaving Mrs. Banbury blinking after her, Miss Marple continued home, her mind quietly sifting through the fragments of conversation and observation. She could not help but wonder why Sir Geoffrey had been so quick to dismiss the theft. And why Lady Clara, usually so composed, had been quite so distressed. And then there was Mr. Marsh, the outsider conveniently present when the brooch vanished. But to Miss Marple it all seemed rather too obvious. Settling into her chair by the window, she resumed, her knitting, her eyes soft, yet sharp, as though seeing far beyond the walls of her sitting-room. There were layers here, she knew, and the truth, as always, would lie beneath them. Here is Chapter 4, First Suspects, of Miss Marple and the Case of the Amber Brooch. Chapter 4, First Suspects. By late afternoon, Inspector Craddock's interviews had yielded little but gossip and speculation, though some of it was more pointed than he might have expected. The Whispering Corner, as Miss Marple often called the bench outside the post office, was unusually crowded that day, with Mrs. Banbury, Mrs. Pettigrew, Miss Simmons, and young Jenny Bartlett, all seated under the pretence of taking the air. As Craddock passed by, heads leaned together, and voices dropped to a conspiratorial murmur. "I tell you," Mrs. Banbury whispered, fanning herself, "it has to be Mr. Marsh. No one knows where he came from. And he was hovering about Lady Clara all afternoon." Miss Simmons, adjusting her hat, nodded earnestly. "And you saw how he was studying those antiques. A man with an eye for value, if you ask me. But wouldn't he be cleverer than to take something so publicly?" ventured Jenny Bartlett, though her voice trembled slightly as all eyes turned to her. Mrs. Pettigrew sniffed. "Sometimes it's the cleverest ones who make the boldest moves." Inspector Craddock, overhearing just enough to confirm what he had suspected, made a mental note to pay Mr. Marsh a more direct visit. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, seated by her window, with her embroidery, watched with quiet amusement as the tide of village opinion swayed like wind over the fields. She could guess precisely what was being said, and more importantly, who was encouraging which narrative. But while the village buzzed about Mr. Marsh, Inspector Craddock was also privately considering another name. Sir Geoffrey Cranley, who had been so eager to downplay the theft. After all, it wasn't lost on the inspector that Sir Geoffrey's business affairs had been whispered about before. Some poor investments, it was said, and perhaps a mounting debt or two. And what if Sir Geoffrey had quietly arranged for the brooch to disappear in hopes of insurance or private sale? The brooch was worth a small fortune, after all. When Inspector Craddock arrived at the small cottage Mr. Marsh had rented, he found the man at his desk, surrounded by papers and old books, a half-drunk cup of tea nearby. "Mr. Marsh," Craddock began politely, "I wonder if you could spare a few minutes." Marsh looked up with a flicker of unease, before masking it with a polite smile. "Of course, Inspector. I suppose this is about the brooch." "It is," Craddock said evenly, taking out his notebook. "You were seen speaking with Lady Clara shortly before the brooch disappeared." "Yes." Marsh nodded, frowning slightly. "We were discussing an old piece of silver she had on display, a Georgian tea set. I'm something of a collector, you see." "Quite," Craddock said, glancing at the array of items on Marsh's desk, including a small magnifying glass and a jeweller's loupe, which certainly didn't help dispel suspicions. "And after that conversation, I believe I walked toward the tea tent. No one can place you there at the exact time the brooch was missed," Craddock pointed out. Marsh stiffened. "Well, no. But I assure you, Inspector, I have no need to steal, nor any reason." Craddock looked up sharply. "You know its value, of course." Marsh hesitated, then said slowly, "Yes, I do. But knowledge doesn't make me guilty." Craddock shut his notebook. "Perhaps not, but I may need to speak with you again." Craddock left. He passed Miss Marple walking along the lane, basket on her arm, as if she were merely heading to fetch eggs. "Good afternoon, Inspector," she said sweetly, pausing beside him. "Miss Marple," Craddock acknowledged, tipping his hat. "You've been speaking with Mr. Marsh, I see." "Indeed. He seems nervous." Miss Marple smiled thoughtfully. "Oh, but nervousness is not always a sign of guilt, Inspector. Sometimes it is merely a sign of a person with something else to hide. Or perhaps someone unused to village scrutiny." Craddock gave her a curious look. "You have another thought, Miss Marple," adjusted her gloves delicately. "Well, Inspector, I was only thinking how strange it is, don't you find, that a brooch so tightly fastened could vanish without notice? Unless, of course, someone was quite accustomed to Lady Clara's wardrobe. Someone who knew how to approach her without raising alarm." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking of Sir Geoffrey?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, not thinking, Inspector. Just observing. Human nature is very curious, you know. People are seldom what they appear. And sometimes those who seem guilty are quite innocent, while others—" She let her voice trail off. With that, she nodded cheerfully and continued on her way, leaving Craddock staring after her, his thoughts suddenly more tangled than before. Back at the manor, Lady Clara sat alone in her drawing-room, fingers toying anxiously with a delicate lace handkerchief. Sir Geoffrey had gone out for a business meeting, though Clara suspected that was merely an excuse. Her mind kept returning to that brooch, and what its loss might bring to light. And as Miss Marple walked past the manor's gates on her way home, her sharp eyes took in the empty window of Sir Geoffrey's study, and the maid hastily shutting the garden door, as if to keep something, or someone, unseen. Yes, Miss Marple mused, there were many secrets in Little Bindon, and the brooch was only the tip of a much deeper story. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The next morning dawned clear and bright, but Little Bindon was still wrapped in the shadows of its latest scandal. The manor gates, usually welcoming to visitors and tradesmen alike, remained firmly closed. Only a lone gardener clipped the hedges, glancing nervously toward the windows. Miss Marple, after her usual breakfast of tea and toast, set out with her basket, ostensibly to deliver some lavender sachets to the vicar's wife. But as always, her errands had a way of taking her near the people and places where answers often waited to be found. At the post office, Miss Simmons was sorting letters when Miss Marple arrived, and behind her usual crisp manner there was a gleam of curiosity. "Oh, Miss Marple! You've heard, of course. Inspector Craddock's been about asking questions." Miss Marple smiled gently. "So I gather. Such an unfortunate business. Poor Lady Clara must be beside herself." Miss Simmons leaned in confidentially. "And now they say that Mr. Marsh is under suspicion. Though between you and me, I wonder if they aren't looking in the wrong direction." "Oh?" said Miss Marple innocently. "Well," Miss Simmons whispered, glancing around, "I saw the maid Emily running out to post a letter late last night. After dark it was." "A letter?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft. "How unusual!" "Exactly," Miss Simmons nodded, "and I could have sworn she looked pale as milk." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, accepting her change and tucking it neatly into her bag. She took her leave, but her mind was already whirring. She had intended to return home, but instead found her feet carrying her toward the manor, where the gardener was now working near the rose bushes. "Good morning, Mr. Sims," she called, smiling. "The roses are lovely this year." "Morning, Miss Marple. Bit of trouble at the house, though," he said, glancing toward the windows. "Yes, I heard. Quite distressing for everyone, I'm sure." He nodded grimly. Lady Clara's locked herself away, and Sir Geoffrey's nowhere to be found. Not like him to disappear like that. Miss Marple paused, then asked gently, Sims, you were there on the day of the party, weren't you? Working in the garden?" "That's right. I was trimming back the yews. Saw most everyone coming and going. Did you happen to notice anyone near Lady Clara's table? Just before she missed the brooch?" Mr. Sims wiped his brow. "Well, Sir Geoffrey was there, but he left to speak to that solicitor fellow. Then there was Mr. Marsh, of course, and—" He hesitated. "Yes?" Miss Marple prompted softly. "Well, funny thing, miss. Emily, the maid, she was there too. Came rushing out to the garden, but I thought she was bringing drinks or some such. But she didn't have anything with her when she left." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained. "How interesting!" She thanked Mr. Sims and continued along the garden path, her sharp eyes roving over the neat flower beds. And it was then that she noticed something curious. Among the roses, a small scrap of pale blue cloth caught on a thorn. Carefully she retrieved it. The material was fine linen, trimmed with delicate lace, not something a gardener or workman would wear, but rather the kind of handkerchief carried by a lady of the house, or a maid trying to appear more refined than her station. Miss Marple folded the cloth and slipped it into her handbag, her mind already piecing together what this tiny fragment might mean. Instead of heading home, she made her way to the vicarage, where she was warmly greeted by Mrs. Dane, the vicar's wife. "Miss Marple, what a lovely surprise." "Dear Mrs. Dane," Miss Marple said, setting down her basket, "I hope you don't think me forward, but I find myself in need of a little advice. Of the moral sort." Mrs. Dane blinked, intrigued. "Of course, dear. What troubles you?" Miss Marple leaned forward. "I've been wondering about how sometimes when people find themselves in difficult situations, they may take desperate steps, things they might never do otherwise, especially if they are frightened for themselves or for someone they care about." Mrs. Dane, perceptive as ever, tilted her head. "You're thinking of the theft, I suppose?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "One hears things, my dear, and I cannot help but wonder. What would make a young maid risk her place in a household by sneaking out letters at night, or possibly being seen in places she shouldn't be during a party?" Mrs. Dane's eyes widened slightly, but she said, "Nothing." Miss Marple rose, patting her hand. "Oh, don't worry, my dear. I'm merely thinking aloud. But perhaps a small kindness to Emily wouldn't be amiss. Sometimes people need a friend when they've gotten themselves into a tangle." With that gentle suggestion, Miss Marple took her leave, walking back toward her cottage, her mind clearer now. The hidden clue had presented itself. Not just the scrap of linen, but Emily's strange behaviour. But what connection could a frightened maid, a missing brooch, and Sir Geoffrey's debts possibly have? Miss Marple smiled to herself. The pieces were beginning to fit, but not quite yet, not until she was sure. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The peaceful facade of Little Bindon was beginning to crack under the strain of whispered suspicions and tight-lipped conversations. By the following day, everyone in the village seemed to have a theory, each more elaborate than the last, about who might have taken Lady Clara's amber brooch and why. But Miss Marple, moving with quiet purpose, knew that beneath the surface of polite smiles and clipped words, there were deeper currents she intended to follow. She began her morning visit to the manor, carrying a basket of scones as a pretext to see Lady Clara, who had reportedly not left her room since the day of the party. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, answered the door, looking harried. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you! But Lady Clara, well, she's not receiving visitors." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Perhaps I could simply leave these with you, though I wonder if you'd allow me a brief word. I have such fond memories of Lady Clara, and I thought she might benefit from a friendly ear." Mrs. Finch hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in trying." Led up the grand staircase, Miss Marple was shown to Lady Clara's sitting-room. The once elegant figure of Lady Clara was now a pale shadow, reclining near the window, her eyes distant. "Miss Marple," she said faintly, as the housekeeper withdrew. "Forgive me, I'm not fit for company." "Nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair beside her. "I brought you some of my scones. You always did have a fondness for them." Lady Clara managed a thin smile. "Thank you. It's good of you to think of me." They sat in silence for a moment before Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "Lady Clara, I hope you won't think me impertinent, but I wonder if there's something troubling you beyond the loss of the brooch." Lady Clara's fingers twitched against her lap. "What could be more troubling than having a precious family heirloom stolen?" "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "But sometimes when things like this happen, it's because something deeper is amiss. Sometimes people act out of fear or desperation." Lady Clara looked away, her eyes glistening. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple patted her hand lightly. "Of course, my dear. I only wish to say that, should you ever wish to speak confidentially, I am always ready to listen." Lady Clara said nothing, but as Miss Marple left the room, she was certain she had planted a necessary seed of trust. On her way back through the village, Miss Marple stopped at the Black Swan Inn, where Mr. Marsh was nursing a drink, a deep frown carved into his features. "Mr. Marsh," Miss Marple greeted him, sliding into the chair opposite with a kind smile. "I do hope I'm not intruding." He looked up, startled, but then managed a polite nod. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Something to drink?" "No, thank you. I was simply passing and wondered how you were bearing up. These things can weigh heavily, can't they?" Marsh snorted. "That's putting it mildly." "Quite. And of course, being so close to the family, I imagine you feel rather responsible." His brow darkened. "Lady Clara trusted me to handle her affairs. I failed her. If the brooch isn't found, the whole estate could be in jeopardy." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "They do say Sir Geoffrey has had his share of troubles, some rather serious debts, I've heard. One imagines that puts pressure on everyone." Marsh's hand tightened around his glass. "I warned him," he muttered, "but Geoffrey never listens. always thinks he can gamble his way out of trouble." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "It's hard to watch someone you care about make mistakes." He gave her a sharp look, but said nothing more. Later that afternoon, Emily the maid was on her way back from the village, when Miss Marple happened to meet her on the path. "My dear, you look quite flustered," Miss Marple observed. Kindly, Emily flushed. "Oh, it's nothing, miss, just some errands." "I do hope you're not overburdened," Miss Marple said gently. "Lady Clara must be very upset, and that can make things difficult for everyone." Emily bit her lip, but said nothing. "Miss," Marple continued softly, "you know, I was thinking about that lovely linen handkerchief I found near the rose bushes. So unusual to see such fine lace, isn't it? Not something a gardener would carry." Emily paled. I don't know anything about that, Miss Marple." "Of course, dear. But if ever you do wish to speak, well, you know where I am." With that, Miss Marple moved on, leaving Emily standing pale and trembling in her wake. That evening, over a quiet cup of tea, Miss Marple reflected on what she had gathered: Sir Geoffrey's debts and reckless behaviour, Mr. Marsh's bitterness and frustration, and his deep connection to the family. Lady Clara's hidden distress, as though she were concealing something even worse than the theft itself. And Emily, whose fear seemed far greater than what might be expected from a mere maid caught up in a scandal. One thing was clear. There were many secrets swirling beneath the calm surface of Little Bindon, and if she was right, those secrets were all tied to the brooch's disappearance, and to the murder that followed. As Miss Marple gazed out the window at the moonlit village, she knew that the web was tightening, and someone would soon make a mistake. Chapter 7. Another Twist. The next morning dawned over Little Bindon with an uneasy stillness. The village, though outwardly calm, buzzed with restless undercurrents, and by mid-morning something happened that would shake its already trembling heart. Miss Marple was tending her roses when young Thomas Finch, the housekeeper's son, came, rushing down the lane, breathless and wide-eyed. "Miss Marple! Miss Marple! They found something at the manor!" he cried, waving his cap in one hand. Miss Marple looked up calmly, though her heart quickened. Now, Thomas, take a breath, and tell me what's happened." Thomas gulped in air. "They found a body, miss, in the orchard, behind the old tool shed." For a moment the garden around her seemed unnaturally quiet. "A body?" she repeated gently. "Yes, miss. Mr. Marsh found him. Sir Geoffrey, miss. He's dead." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line, but she patted Thomas's arm kindly. "You've been very helpful, my dear boy. Why don't you run along home now?" As Thomas sprinted away, Miss Marple rose, dusted the soil from her hands, and set out at once for the manor, her mind already working furiously. By the time she arrived, Inspector Craddock was already there, his face dark with frustration. "Miss Marple," he greeted her tersely, "I suppose you've heard?" "I have, Inspector. And naturally I thought I might be of some small assistance," she said mildly. Craddock sighed, but something in his eyes showed he welcomed her presence, even if he wouldn't say so aloud. "I suppose there's no harm. The scene's still being secured. Sir Geoffrey was found lying behind the tool shed, about 30 yards from the orchard gate. May I see?" He hesitated, then nodded, leading her around the house. Behind the shed, Sir Geoffrey lay motionless, his cravat loosened, his face pale and oddly peaceful. But what caught Miss Marple's eye was the dark bruise along his temple and the scattered remains of a broken glass bottle nearby. Craddock crouched beside the body. "Blow to the head. The doctor says it was quick. Probably didn't see it coming." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the bottle. "Brandy?" she asked softly. Craddock nodded. "Looks that way. And he wasn't known to be a heavy drinker, despite his gambling." Miss Marple murmured. She glanced around. A set of footprints, muddied from the morning dew, led to and from the spot. 2 different sets, she noted carefully. "Anything missing?" she asked. Craddock looked surprised at the question. "Nothing that we've noticed." "Not even an amber brooch?" she asked lightly. He blinked. "Well, no, but I wouldn't be surprised if this murder is connected to that theft." Miss Marple smiled faintly, but said nothing. Back inside the manor, Lady Clara was near collapse, her face ashen. Miss Marple was shown in, and as the door closed behind her, she took the frail woman's hand gently. "My dear Lady Clara, I cannot begin to imagine how difficult this must be." Lady Clara looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "Miss Marple, Geoffrey." "Oh, what will become of us now?" Miss Marple's tone was soft but steady. "And it is what I hope to find out, my dear." Lady Clara clutched her hand tightly. "He wasn't a good man, Miss Marple. He was in so much trouble. But he was my son, my only son, I know, dear. And trouble does not always mean guilt. But tell me, Lady Clara, is there anything you haven't yet shared? Anything that might help us understand what has happened?" Clara hesitated, glancing at the closed door. "Miss Marple, Geoffrey had been pressing me to sell some of the family jewels. Not just the amber brooch, other things too. I refused. I think—" Her voice broke. "I think he might have taken the brooch himself to force my hand. But now—" Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "You are very brave to tell me this. It may be the key to understanding." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Emily the maid, who was scrubbing the stone steps of her small cottage, her eyes red from crying. "My dear Emily," Miss Marple said kindly, "this must be a terrible time for you." Smollett looked away quickly. "I don't want to talk about it, miss." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said softly, "it helps to unburden oneself, especially when one has been carrying a secret." Emily's shoulders stiffened. Miss Marple sat beside her on the low stone wall. "You see, my dear, when I was younger, I saw many young women get into trouble over things they didn't fully understand. People like Sir Geoffrey can be very persuasive, can't they?" Emily's breath caught. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Miss Marple looked at her gently. "You were very upset when I mentioned the handkerchief. And now Sir Geoffrey is dead. You must be very frightened." Tears began to fall down Emily's cheeks. I didn't kill him. I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't." Miss Marple patted her arm soothingly. "I know, my dear, but someone did. And the sooner we know the whole story, the sooner you'll be safe." Emily looked around fearfully, then whispered, He told me to take the brooch. He said if I didn't, he'd ruin me. He said he needed money, that his mother wouldn't help him. I was going to give it back. I didn't want it, miss. But now he's dead." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was sharp with thought. There, dear," she murmured. "You've done the right thing in telling me." As Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind whirled with revelations. Sir Geoffrey had likely orchestrated the brooch's theft. Emily, terrified and manipulated, had played an unwilling part. And now Sir Geoffrey himself was dead, struck down, perhaps by the very person he had sought to deceive. But who? Someone else had more to lose, or more to hide, than even Sir Geoffrey himself. And Miss Marple, in her quiet way, was growing ever closer to the truth. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The village of Little Bindon was abuzz with speculation. 2 shocking deaths. First Lady Clara's amber brooch stolen, now Sir Geoffrey found dead. Every whispered conversation in the shops, every murmur over garden fences was heavy with suspicion and fear. But Miss Marple, walking along the path to the vicarage, had an air of quiet determination. She had one final test to perform, a test to lay bare the truth she now suspected. Inside the vicarage, Mrs. Rosalind Gray, Sir Geoffrey's cousin, sat primly on the sofa, sipping tea from a delicate china cup. Her fingers trembled slightly, though her face was composed. Miss Marple had asked for this tea under the guise of seeking comfort and guidance, but in truth she had chosen her company very carefully. "Such dreadful events, Miss Marple," Rosalind said softly. "It is difficult to believe all this could happen in such a peaceful place." "Indeed, my dear," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes twinkling. "So very shocking. One would think there must have been a great deal of unhappiness behind the scenes." "Oh, but you would know better than I, dear, being family and all." Rosalind gave a polite smile. "Well, of course, Sir Geoffrey was troubled, but I never imagined such an end." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "You know, I was thinking this morning about family heirlooms, how they so often carry memories and meaning beyond mere monetary value. Why, I remember a story of a woman who went to great lengths to keep a certain brooch in her family, even after it was thought lost." Rosalind stiffened ever so slightly. Miss Marple continued gently, as if musing to herself. "It must be a dreadful thing to see a family's most treasured piece of history sold away, or worse, stolen." Rosalind set her teacup down, her fingers now white around the handle. "Yes, dreadful." Miss Marple looked up with innocent blue eyes. "And yet, if one had a reason, if, say, one had always resented being left out of things, being passed over in a will, perhaps, well, I suppose one might act in desperation, especially if one thought it would soon all slip away." For a moment, silence. Then Rosalind gave a brittle laugh. "Miss Marple, surely you don't suggest I—" "Oh, no, dear, merely a thought. But imagine," Miss Marple said softly, "if someone had learned that Sir Geoffrey was planning to take the brooch for himself. Imagine if that person had already taken it, quietly, cleverly, and could not bear to see Geoffrey ruin the family name by selling it. I wonder what such a person might do to keep the secret safe." Rosalind's face was pale now, her eyes darting to the window. Miss Marple leaned forward just a little. "And when Geoffrey threatened to expose the truth, when he realized he might be able to use the brooch to manipulate you, well, then perhaps Something had to be done. Rosalind stood abruptly, her hand clutching the edge of the table. "Miss Marple, I think—" But Miss Marple's voice, though gentle, was firm. "You see, my dear, I realized it was you when I noticed the bottle near Sir Geoffrey's body. Such an odd thing to be there, except that you, my dear, were often seen carrying a small flask of brandy. And then there was that day in Lady Clara's drawing-room. You said you admired the amber brooch greatly, far too greatly." Rosalind's eyes filled with sudden fury. "You old woman, you think you know everything." Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. "Oh, no, dear, not everything, but enough." Rosalind's voice shook. "He was going to ruin everything. The estate, my inheritance, all for his debts. And then he tried to blackmail me over the brooch. Said he knew I had it. I had no choice." "There's always a choice, my dear," Miss Marple said sadly. At that moment, Inspector Craddock stepped in from the hallway, having listened to the entire confession from behind the door. "Thank you, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Miss Grey, I'm afraid you'll have to come with me." Rosalind's face crumpled, and she sank into the chair as if all the strength had left her. Later, as Miss Marple walked home through the village, she reflected quietly. "Such a pity," she murmured to herself. "People never realize that greed and pride always leave a trace. Always." She paused to admire a cluster of early spring roses, her sharp eyes softening. "And in the end, it's always the smallest thing, a misplaced word, a careless action, that gives it all away." She walked on, her figure small but resolute, boom against the village lane, as peace slowly began to return to Little Bindon. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The next afternoon, the drawing-room at Lady Clara's estate was unusually full. Nearly all of Little Bindon's residents had gathered, ostensibly for a quiet tea, but in truth to hear what Miss Marple had uncovered. Lady Clara herself sat stiffly in her armchair, her face pale but composed. Colonel Willoughby looked grim, and Inspector Craddock stood by the window, arms folded, waiting for Miss Marple to speak. At last Miss Marple, sitting in her usual modest way, placed her cup gently on its saucer and looked up. "Well, my dears," she began softly, "I think it is only right that you all know the truth about what has happened." A hush fell over the room. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "it all began with the amber brooch, which seemed such a small matter, but as with many things it was only the surface of a much deeper trouble." Lady Clara gave a soft sigh, as though confirming Miss Marple's words. The brooch had been in the family for generations, and to some it was far more than an ornament. It represented status, security, even power. The vicar leaned forward, slightly. "And it was stolen, wasn't it, Miss Marple?" "Yes, Reverend, but not by an outsider as some thought. It was taken by someone who knew its value and had access to Lady Clara's private rooms." Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on Mrs. Rosalind Grey's now empty seat, as though her presence still lingered. It was Rosalind who took the brooch, and out of resentment and fear. You see, she believed Sir Geoffrey would squander what little was left of the family fortune, and she thought to keep the brooch from him. But when Geoffrey found out, and began to threaten her with exposure, she saw no other way out. Gasps went around the room. Lady Clara's hand went to her throat. "But how did you know, Miss Marple?" asked Colonel Willoughby, his brow furrowed. Miss Marple smiled slightly. "There were small things, Colonel. They always tell the tale, if one knows how to look." She ticked them off gently on her fingers. First, when the brooch disappeared, Rosalind was one of the few who knew where Lady Clara kept it. Then, at tea one afternoon, I noticed how Rosalind spoke of the brooch's history with a certain possessiveness, almost as if she already saw it as hers. Later, when Sir Geoffrey was found dead, there was a bottle by his side, a flask of brandy that did not belong to him. You see, Sir Geoffrey had a well-known preference for whisky, not brandy. But Rosalind, I had seen, carried a silver flask of brandy in her bag for medical purposes, she said. Lady Clara closed her eyes as if everything was becoming clear at last. Miss Marple's voice softened. When Geoffrey discovered Rosalind's theft and attempted to blackmail her, she saw her future crumbling, and in desperation she acted. Inspector Craddock nodded gravely. She added a fatal dose of sleeping powder to Geoffrey's brandy. The medical report confirmed it. Colonel Willoughby exhaled deeply. "Good Lord!" Miss Marple folded, her hands in her lap. "It was all very clever. But human nature, dear Colonel, is never so tidy. Rosalind could not hide her growing anxiety, and when I gently mentioned people who had fought to keep an heirloom at any cost, her reaction was most revealing." A pause filled the room. The weight of the truth seemed to settle heavily on everyone's shoulders. At last, Lady Clara spoke, her voice low but steady. "You've uncovered a terrible truth, Miss Marple, but I suppose I should be grateful to know it. Better that than to let suspicion hang over us all." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "I am sorry, my dear, but as I always say, evil deeds do not stay buried, not in a village like Little Bindon." Lady Clara nodded, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "And the brooch?" asked the vicar quietly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled for a brief moment. "Ah, yes, it was found, quite safe, in Rosalind's sewing basket, tucked under a false bottom." Another murmur ran around the room. "Well, I never!" exclaimed Miss Hartley, the postmistress, with a huff. Miss Marple rose gently from her chair, smoothing her skirt. "And now, I think, perhaps Lady Clara would appreciate some peace. It has been a difficult time for everyone." She glanced around kindly, yet firmly, and the villagers, murmuring among themselves, began to gather their things and drift away. As Miss Marple made her way toward the door, Lady Clara reached out and took her hand. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't know how to say it properly, but thank you." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Think nothing of it, my dear. But perhaps," she added softly, "it is time to be careful whom we trust, and to remember that even those closest to us may have secrets." With that, Miss Marple stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, her sharp eyes observing the world around her with quiet understanding. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The days that followed the dramatic revelation in Lady Clara's drawing-room passed with a strange mixture of relief and unease in the village of Little Bindon. Though Mrs. Rosalind Gray had been quietly taken away by Inspector Craddock's men, avoiding a public scene, her absence left a palpable void in the community. Whispers followed wherever villagers gathered, at the baker's, at the church, and of course at the tea shop, where gossip was as freely poured as the tea itself. Miss Hartley, standing behind the post office counter, declared to anyone who would listen, "Well, I always said there was something not quite right about that woman. So grand, so aloof. And look where it led her." Yet even those who had suspected Rosalind couldn't help but feel a chill of discomfort. For if she, a woman known for her poise and apparent kindness, could commit murder, then what did that say about the rest of them? At Lady Clara's estate, life attempted to return to its previous routine, but the air was heavier now, the rooms quieter. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, moved about solemnly. Her usually firm footsteps softened, as though she feared disturbing, lingering ghosts. Dear Clara herself took to walking more often in her garden, her figure smaller somehow, though still upright. The amber brooch, now safely returned, lay locked away, a symbol of both heritage and tragedy. One bright morning, as the spring sun gently warmed the earth and the first roses began to bloom, Miss Marple paid a final visit to Lady Clara. They sat together under the pergola, the garden around them alive with the hum of bees and the distant song of birds. A tray of tea sat between them, untouched for the moment. "It's strange," Lady Clara murmured, watching a butterfly alight on a nearby rose. "How life can seem so serene, and yet hide such darkness beneath." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes, my dear, villages are like that, quiet on the outside, but full of secrets inside. I always say one need only sit still and listen, and eventually people show you who they really are." Lady Clara turned to her, a faint smile on her lips. "You have a way of seeing things, Miss Marple, of understanding people." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes twinkling, though her expression remained thoughtful. "Oh, not always, but I've lived long enough to see that human nature is much the same everywhere, and that when something terrible happens, it's often because someone was afraid or desperate, or sometimes simply greedy." Lady Clara sighed. "Do you think people will forget?" Miss Marple stirred her tea, watching the ripples settle. "In time, perhaps, but not completely. These things leave marks, even if they fade. You'll see people being a little more careful, a little more watchful, at least for a while." Lady Clara was silent for a moment. "I suppose that's not a bad thing." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Not always." They sat in quiet companionship, each lost in thought. As Miss Marple rose to leave, Lady Clara stood as well, reaching out to gently take her hand. "I'm grateful, you know," she said, "for the truth, even if it hurts." Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. "Better to know, my dear, than to live with doubt and fear. And now, perhaps, you can find some peace." With a final smile, Miss Marple turned and walked slowly back down the garden path, her steps unhurried, her sharp eyes taking in the blooming roses, the swaying trees, the peaceful facade of Little Bindon, a facade she knew better than most. As she reached the gate, she paused, looking back one last time at Lady Clara's grand but lonely house, before moving on, blending once more into the gentle rhythm of village life. For the world went on, as it always did, but for those who had glimpsed its darker corners, it would never be quite the same again. and Miss Marple, for her part, would return to her knitting and garden, ever watchful, ever ready for the next shadow to fall over. The peaceful streets of Little Bindon. Chapter 11. A Whisper of New Shadows. Several weeks had passed since the dramatic resolution of the case that had gripped Little Bindon. The amber brooch was now safely tucked away, and while gossips still fluttered through the lanes and tea-rooms, the village had begun to settle back into its usual rhythm. On a particularly bright morning, Miss Marple sat in her sunny sitting-room, the window open to let in the gentle scent of roses and lavender that filled her small, well-tended garden. A tray with tea and perfectly buttered scones sat at her side, though she seemed more interested in her knitting, fingers moving deftly as she watched the world beyond her window. There was a soft knock at her door, followed by the hesitant entrance of young Emily Warren, the vicar's niece, a quiet, thoughtful girl of about 20, who had always been polite but somewhat timid. "Miss Marple," Emily said, wringing her gloved hands, "I do hope I'm not disturbing you." Miss Marple looked up with a kind smile, setting her knitting aside. "Not at all, my dear. Come in, come in. You look rather troubled. Sit down and have a cup of tea." Emily sat gingerly, her eyes darting to the window and then back to Miss Marple. "I'm sorry to impose. It's just I didn't know who else to speak to." Miss Marple poured tea with calm precision. "Now that sounds interesting. What is it, dear?" Emily hesitated, then leaned in slightly. Her voice lowered. "It's probably nothing, but I've noticed something strange at the old Chadwick cottage." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose ever so slightly, though her voice remained gentle. "Oh, the Chadwick place? I thought that had been empty for months." "That's just it," Emily whispered. "It should be empty, but I've seen a light in the window late at night, and yesterday, when I walked past, I could have sworn I heard voices inside. Angry voices." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Really? That is rather odd. And there's more," Emily added, her voice almost a whisper now. "I was near the gate this morning, and I found a button. A man's button, and it had dried blood on it." For a moment there was silence, broken only by the distant chirping of birds and the tick of Miss Marple's clock. "Well, my dear," Miss Marple said at last, her eyes sharper than usual, though her smile remained soft, "perhaps it is nothing, but as I always say, little things can sometimes mean a great deal." She reached out to gently pat Emily's hand. "Why don't you leave that button with me, and I'll think on it. You've done quite right to come." Emily relaxed slightly, though the worry still lingered in her gaze. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I knew you'd understand." After Emily had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly for a time, turning the button over in her hand, examining the faint trace of dried blood in the afternoon light. "Well, well," she murmured to herself, "it seems peace and quiet never do last long in Little Bindon." With that, she rose to fetch her hat and gloves, her knitting left behind on the chair, forgotten for now. For though one mystery had been solved, another was already beginning to cast its shadow over the village, and Miss Marple, ever observant, ever quietly formidable, was ready to face it. Chapter 12. The Shadow at Chadwick Cottage. The next morning dawned crisp and bright, but Miss Marple's thoughts were already clouded by curiosity and concern. She had examined the button carefully the night before. A fine, old-fashioned piece, the kind worn on a gentleman's waistcoat, with an intricate silver crest engraved at its centre. She knew enough about family crests to recognize that this was no ordinary button, and perhaps no ordinary man to whom it had belonged. As she sipped her morning tea and nibbled on a thin slice of toast, her mind ticked over possibilities. It was not like Miss Marple to act hastily, but neither was she one to ignore the subtle hints of danger when they appeared. By mid-morning, she had made up her mind. Fetching her coat and walking stick, she set off toward the village, her steps slow but purposeful. Along the way, she passed Mr. Abbott, the grumpy postmaster, who was sweeping the front of his shop. "Out and about early, Miss Marple," he grunted, tipping his hat slightly. "Oh, yes, Mr. Abbott," she replied sweetly. "Such a lovely day, isn't it? One must take the air while one can." "Lovely enough, I suppose," he said, peering at her curiously. "Off to the vicarage, are you?" "Oh, not today. Just a little stroll," she said with a smile, leaving him puzzled as she walked on. But Chadwick Cottage, her true destination, loomed ahead, its ivy-choked walls and shuttered windows giving it an air of neglect and secrecy. She paused at the rusted gate, glancing around to ensure no one was watching, and then carefully pushed it open. It gave a soft groan of protest, but Miss Marple walked up the overgrown path without hesitation. As she neared the front door, something caught her eye, a faint footprint in the soft earth, as though someone had recently passed this way. A man's shoe by the size of it, and not very old, she noted. With a thoughtful frown, Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and knocked gently on the door. There was no answer. She tried again, a little louder. Still nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees. Miss Marple leaned closer to the door, listening. For a moment she thought she heard something, a creak of floorboards inside, or perhaps just her imagination. But when she was about to turn away, a sound came more clearly. A thud, sharp and heavy, as if something or someone had been dropped on the floor. Miss Marple stepped back, eyes narrowing slightly. "Very curious," she murmured to herself. She glanced again at the footprint, then down at the button she had slipped into her pocket before leaving home. Her fingers closed around it thoughtfully. "Well, I suppose," she said softly, "if one finds a button, one ought to find the coat it belongs to." Just then, a figure appeared at the end of the lane. Mr. Lawrence, the solicitor, carrying his leather briefcase and looking rather hurried. He paused when he saw Miss Marple standing at the cottage gate. "Miss Marple, what on earth are you doing here?" he asked, a note of surprise in his voice. "Oh, just a little walk," she said pleasantly. "Such a charming old house, don't you think? It's a pity it's been empty so long." Mr. Lawrence's eyes flickered to the cottage windows, and for a moment something like unease passed over his features. Yes, well, it has been empty," he said quickly, adjusting his briefcase. "No one's lived there since poor old Mr. Chadwick passed on." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, her expression serene. "But you know, I always think an empty house rarely stays empty forever." Mr. Lawrence gave her a sharp look, as though trying to gauge how much she knew. "Well, I must be going," he said briskly. "Good day, Miss Marple." With that, he strode away, leaving Miss Marple watching him thoughtfully. When he had disappeared down the lane, she turned back to the cottage, her mind working swiftly. A footprint, a bloody button, a sound from within, and now Mr. Lawrence's curious reaction. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said to herself as she began her slow walk home. "There is something more to Chadwick Cottage than meets the eye, and I dare say, before long, we shall all find out exactly what." She paused at the garden gate of her own house, casting one last glance over her shoulder toward the lane. "Another puzzle," she murmured with a faint smile. "How very tiresome, and how very interesting." With that, she disappeared inside, already planning her next quiet inquiry. For where there are whispers of trouble, Miss Marple always listens. Chapter 13. A quiet reflection and a new beginning. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple sat quietly in her favourite chair by the window. The amber brooch, now cleaned and polished, lay on a velvet cloth beside her, a symbol of the storm that had swept through the village and had, at last, begun to calm. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she worked at a pale blue scarf, but her thoughts were far from the gentle rhythm of her hands. It had been a difficult business, she mused. Mrs. Blackwell's death, a murder committed with ruthless precision, motivated by greed and hidden resentments, had shaken the village to its very core. Yet the truth had come out, as it always did, and justice, in its quiet way, had been served. Still, the matter of the button found near Chadwick Cottage and the unseen presence inside the supposedly empty house lingered in her mind like an unfinished piece of embroidery. As Miss Marple reached for her tea, there was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called gently. The door creaked open, and to her quiet surprise, Inspector Craddock stepped inside, removing his hat respectfully. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Inspector," Miss Marple said, gesturing toward the chair opposite her. "Do sit down. I was just thinking over the recent unpleasantness." Craddock settled into the chair, his eyes briefly noting the amber brooch on the table before returning to her calm, perceptive gaze. "I thought I'd stop by and give you a little news," he began, leaning forward slightly. "It appears that Chadwick Cottage may not be as empty as we believed." Miss Marple raised a delicate eyebrow. "Indeed? I had rather suspected as much, you—" "No," Craddock chuckled softly. "I imagine you did. But you'll be interested to hear that we've identified the button you found. It belongs to a waistcoat made by an exclusive London tailor, a style favoured by a certain Mr. Josiah Linton." "Mr. Linton?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Yes," Craddock confirmed. "You may recall he was one of Mrs. Blackwell's distant cousins, rumoured to have had a quarrel over money years ago. Oddly enough, he's been seen in the area recently, though he claims to be on business elsewhere. Yet witnesses now say they saw him walking near Chadwick Cottage, and more than once." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-air. "Very curious," she murmured. "A man with a family quarrel, returning to the scene of an inheritance dispute, and visiting an empty cottage. It does make one wonder, doesn't it, Inspector?" "It does," Craddock agreed. "And while we have no evidence linking him directly to Mrs. Blackwell's murder, I can't help but think there may be a second story woven into this tapestry." Miss Marple smiled faintly, returning to her knitting. "You know, Inspector," she said after a pause, Human nature is rarely content with a single wrongdoing. A person capable of one crime may find themselves quite easily led to another, especially when old greed is stirred anew. Craddock nodded thoughtfully. That's why I wanted to speak with you, Miss Marple. You have a way of seeing things others don't. If there's more to this than meets the eye, I'd value your thoughts. Well, we mustn't speculate without cause, Miss Marple said gently, though her sharp eyes twinkled. Still, I should like to take a closer look at Chadwick Cottage. In the daylight, of course. Perhaps there's something left behind that might tell us more about Mr. Linton's visit. I thought you might say that, Craddock replied, standing and adjusting his coat. Shall we say tomorrow morning? That would suit me perfectly, Miss Marple agreed. As the inspector left, Miss Marple sat quietly for a moment longer, her gaze drifting to the brooch beside her. So much had been uncovered. The secrets of Mrs. Blackwell's past, the false trails laid by the villagers, the layers of jealousy and spite that had led to murder. And yet, like a thread left hanging from a hem, there was more to be understood. Her eyes drifted to the twilight outside, where the last light painted the sky in soft hues of amber and rose. Human nature, she whispered to herself, is far more tangled than any skein of wool I have ever known. And with that, she picked up her tea, savouring its warmth, her mind already stitching together the next pieces of the puzzle. For where there are shadows, Miss Marple knows, there are always truths waiting to be revealed. Chapter 14. Chadwick Cottage. Whispers. The next morning dawned bright but chilly, with a pale sun struggling to warm the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, dressed in her well-kept walking coat and carrying her neat little handbag, made her way along the familiar lane toward Chadwick Cottage, where Inspector Craddock awaited her. From the outside, the cottage looked much like any other in the village. Quaint, with ivy clinging to its walls and roses beginning to bud around the windows. But beneath its charm, there was an air of neglect, as though it had been left to fend for itself far longer than anyone cared to admit. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Craddock greeted her, tipping his hat. "You're looking well. Ready for a little exploration? As ready as one can be for poking about in other people's secrets," she replied gently, her eyes twinkling. Craddock unlocked the door, and together they stepped inside. The interior was dim and musty, the curtains drawn, and the air heavy with dust. Furniture stood draped in white cloths, ghostly shapes in the gloom, yet on the table by the window something immediately caught Miss Marple's sharp eye. A cup of tea, now cold, sat beside a scattered deck of cards, as though someone had been interrupted mid-thought. "Well, well," murmured Craddock, noticing her gaze. "Someone's been here recently, no doubt about that." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly, stepping closer to examine the scene. "And look here, not just tea and cards, but—" She reached out, gloved fingers carefully lifting a small, folded letter tucked beneath the deck. Craddock leaned in. "What is it?" Miss Marple read aloud, her voice even. "To whom it may concern, the truth about the Blackwell inheritance lies not where they think. Beware the amber brooch. It hides more than beauty. Look beyond the obvious. J.L." "J.L.," repeated Craddock, frowning. "Josiah Linton, no doubt." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. It appears our Mr. Linton had more on his mind than we realized. She turned the letter over, studying it with narrowed eyes. And this paper, see how it's torn here? Part of something larger, perhaps, or a message meant to be incomplete. Craddock looked grim. If Linton knows something about Mrs. Blackwell's fortune, or about that brooch, we'll need to find him quickly. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, her gaze distant. Because if there's one thing I've learned, Inspector, it's that greed is rarely satisfied with just one victim. Craddock nodded. I'll have my men make discreet inquiries. No need to rouse suspicion just yet. Miss Marple smiled faintly, always wise to let people believe they've gone unnoticed until they reveal themselves, which, in my experience, they always do. She turned to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back one last time at the cards scattered on the table. Monsieur. Queen of Hearts on top, she noted quietly. Curious choice to leave lying there, wouldn't you say, Inspector? Craddock followed her gaze. Meaning? Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, a shadow of thought passing over her features. Only that hearts are easily broken, and sometimes they lead to deadly mistakes. With that enigmatic remark, she stepped out into the fresh morning air, leaving behind the gloom of Chadwick Cottage, but not the secrets it still held close. As she walked away, a thin curtain twitched on an upper window, though neither she nor Craddock turned to see it. Someone was still watching, and Miss Marple, ever perceptive, knew this case was not quite finished yet. Chapter 15. A last piece of the puzzle. It was 2 days later when Miss Marple sat in her little drawing-room, a cup of tea warming her hands, listening quietly to the rain tapping against the window-panes. The village had settled into its usual rhythm, though there was still a lingering buzz in the air, a mixture of gossip, shock, and subtle relief. She had just finished reading a letter from Inspector Craddock, who had written to inform her that Josiah Linton had been located, alive but clearly frightened, hiding out in a guest house on the edge of the next village. He claims he feared for his life after receiving threats, though he won't yet say from whom. Craddock had written. However, he has confirmed that there's more to the amber brooch than anyone suspected. Apparently, it's tied to an unclaimed inheritance, and perhaps to a hidden will Mrs. Blackwell never intended anyone to find. Miss Marple set the letter down thoughtfully, her fingers resting lightly on the embroidered cloth covering her tea table. There was a knock at the door, light, hesitant. "Come in, dear," she called, already knowing who it would be. Harriet Finch entered, pale but composed, her gloved hands twisting a handkerchief. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, though her eyes betrayed a desperate need to speak. "Not at all, dear. Sit down. Would you like some tea?" Harriet shook her head. "No, thank you. She took a deep breath. "I need to ask you something." Miss Marple waited, her gaze soft but attentive. "It's about the brooch," Harriet said finally, her voice low. "You see, I overheard something Mrs. Blackwell said to Josiah before she died." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained gentle. "Go on, my dear." She said, "They'll never know what it hides, Josiah. Let them search, but I'll take the secret to my grave." Harriet swallowed, and Josiah looked frightened, like he didn't want anything to do with it. I think he was afraid of what might happen if anyone found out. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. That would explain quite a bit, wouldn't it? But Miss Marple, Harriet pressed, leaning forward, what was she talking about? What could be so dangerous about a brooch? Miss Marple took a moment to answer, her fingers lightly tracing the handle of her teacup. My dear, she said softly, sometimes people hide things, not only money or jewels, but truths. The brooch, as Inspector Craddock has now confirmed, was more than a pretty trinket. Inside, concealed so cleverly no one would think to look, was a key to a safety deposit box in London. A box that, according to Mr. Linton, contains a second will, leaving everything not to Mr. and Mrs. Pembroke, but to someone else entirely. Harriet's eyes widened. To whom? Miss Marple smiled faintly. To you, my dear. Me? Harriet gasped. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. You see, Mrs. Blackwell had her reasons. She was not as blind as people thought. She knew how she had been manipulated in her later years, and though she never confronted anyone, she left a safeguard. Harriet sat back, her face pale. I had no idea. And yet someone else did, Miss Marple continued. Someone who realized what was at stake, and killed to prevent the truth from emerging. Harriet shivered. Mr. Pembroke, indeed, Miss Marple said quietly. Though it was never about the brooch's surface value, it was always about what it represented. Proof of a secret inheritance and Mrs. Blackwell's final wishes. There was silence between them for a moment, broken only by the soft tick of the clock on the mantelpiece. And now? Harriet asked at last. Now, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. Justice will follow its course. Inspector Craddock will see to that. And you, my dear, will need to decide what to do with what you've inherited. Not just the money, but the burden of truth. Harriet looked down at her hands, her voice trembling. It's so much to take in. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. Life always gives us more than we expect, my dear. The important thing is what we choose to do with it. As Harriet rose to leave, still visibly shaken but stronger somehow, Miss Marple watched her with quiet affection. When the door closed behind her, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, gazing out at the rain-streaked window. In the distance, she could hear the village clock striking 3, its sound echoing through the quiet afternoon. She took a sip of her tea, now cold, and smiled to herself. A soft, knowing smile. Human nature, she murmured. It never really changes. And with that, she picked up her knitting once more, the sharp click of needles filling the room, as outside, life in St. Mary Mead moved on, though forever altered by the truths now unearthed. Chapter 16. Epilogue. Tea and Reflections. It was a bright spring morning, with the sun casting warm golden beams through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting-room. The village of St. Mary Mead, so recently shaken by scandal and murder, now seemed almost itself again. Though in the way of such things, the ripples of the tragedy still lingered beneath the surface. Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair, her knitting needles gently clicking as she worked at a delicate lace shawl, her expression thoughtful and serene. There was a soft knock on the door, and without rising she called, "Come in, dear." It was Colonel Melchett carrying a newspaper and looking, as always, a mixture of gruff and fatherly concern. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair near the fireplace. "Thought I'd drop in to see how you're faring. Quite a business, that was." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Indeed, Colonel. Quite a sad business, though I suppose not. Entirely unexpected, if one has watched people long enough." Melchett grunted, unfolding the paper. "Well, it's all here in black and white. Pembroke arrested, charged. Seems the police found enough evidence once they had reason to look. And, of course, with Linton's statement and that key found in the brooch. Well, it's an open and shut case now." "Poor Harriet," Miss Marple murmured, "though I imagine she will find her way. Sometimes knowing the truth is painful, but also freeing." Melchett nodded. "Yes, she's stronger than she looks, that one. And the money, when it comes, will help her set up a life of her own, I dare say." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It was never truly about the money, you know. For some people, it is the recognition of love, of being valued. That means the most. Mrs. Blackwell saw more than anyone gave her credit for. She knew who was loyal and who wasn't. Her last act was to set things right in her own quiet way." Melchett looked at her over the edge of his paper. "You're a sharp one, Miss Marple, and I don't know how you do it. Sitting there with your knitting, watching, listening, and yet seeing what all the rest of us miss." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Oh, Colonel, I have often said that human nature is the same everywhere. Whether it's in a great city or a little village like ours, people may hide their thoughts and feelings, but eventually their true selves show. In small ways. A glance, a hesitation, a word said in anger." She paused, her eyes thoughtful. "You see, people forget that the simplest things, an old brooch, a look exchanged in a room, can be the key to unlocking the greatest mysteries." The Colonel shook his head, though there was a hint of admiration in his voice. "You should have been a detective, Miss Marple." Miss Marple laughed, her blue eyes twinkling. "Oh, but I am, Colonel, in my own way." There was a comfortable silence between them for a moment, filled only by the distant chirping of birds in the garden. "Still," Melchett said at last, rising, "to leave, I hope we won't be having any more murders in St. Mary Mead for a good long time." "One can hope," Miss Marple agreed, though her expression turned slightly wry as she added, "But human nature, Colonel, has a way of surprising us." Melchett chuckled and tipped his hat. "Too true, Miss Marple, too true." As he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her fingers moving deftly over the fine thread. Through the window, she could see the village green, where children were now playing as though the shadows of the past weeks had never touched them. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Justice had been done, quietly, without fanfare, but thoroughly. And as always, life went on in St. Mary Mead, its quiet surface concealing endless little dramas, secrets and stories, just waiting for a keen eye to uncover them. With a sigh of contentment, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, watching the light dance across her sitting room. Yes, she whispered to herself, human nature never changes. And I suppose that means there will always be mysteries to solve. And with that, she picked up her knitting once more, her mind as sharp and thoughtful as ever. Chapter 17. Quiet Reflections at Sunset. The sun was setting over St. Mary Mead, casting long golden rays across the well-tended gardens and tidy hedges. From her window, Miss Marple could see the soft glow of lamplight, beginning to flicker in her neighbours' windows one by one. As though the entire village was tucking itself in for the night, eager to forget the unsettling days now behind them. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, a cup of tea gently steaming beside her, untouched. Her eyes were distant, watching the silhouettes of the village rooftops against the fiery sky. There was a tranquillity to the scene, and yet in the depths of her mind, thoughts still stirred, refusing to be soothed by the peace of the evening. The case of the amber brooch had been unravelled, its dark threads carefully teased apart, but there was always something that lingered after such events. Something about the fragility of human relationships, the ease with which trust could be broken, and how greed and jealousy could twist even the gentlest souls. She thought of Harriet Blackwell, walking alone now among her roses, her future uncertain, her past forever marked by her aunt's cruel end. She thought of Mr. Pembroke, now in custody, a man undone by his own ambition and desperation. And she thought, too, of those who had nothing to do with the crime, but whose lives had still been touched and altered. Mrs. Banbury, forever changed in her view of the world, and young Thomas, who had discovered his employer's body and would never forget the shock of that moment. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the faint scent of lilac from the garden, and with it memories of her own youth, of a time when life seemed simpler, though perhaps it never truly had been. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, her eyes softening as she reflected. People are so complicated, she thought, and yet so very much the same. One might hope that age would bring wisdom, that love would triumph over selfishness, but again and again we see that pride, fear, and greed are always there, lurking in the hearts of even the most respectable folk. She set her teacup down carefully on its saucer, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. A small smile touched her lips, not one of amusement, but of understanding. "It is as I always say," she mused silently. "Human nature is much like my garden. Beautiful on the surface, but beneath the roses one must always beware the thorns." As the sky deepened to twilight, the first stars began to prick the heavens, tiny points of light in a darkening world, and Miss Marple sat quietly watching them, knowing that while one mystery was solved, life in St. Mary Mead would continue, with all its small joys, secret sorrows, and perhaps future puzzles to untangle. For a woman who understood human nature as she did, there would always be something to observe, something to learn, and, when the time came, another secret to uncover. As the last light faded and the lamplight bathed her room in a warm, golden glow, Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more. The familiar click of needles was comforting, steady, a rhythm against the chaos of life. And so she sat, calm and thoughtful, as night gently embraced St. Mary Mead. Chapter 17. Quiet Reflections at Sunset. The sun was setting over St. Mary Mead, casting long golden rays across the well-tended gardens and tidy hedges. From her window, Miss Marple could see the soft glow of lamplight beginning to flicker in her neighbours' windows, one by one, as though the entire village was tucking itself in for the night, eager to forget the unsettling days now behind them. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, a cup of tea gently steaming beside her, untouched. Her eyes were distant, watching the silhouettes of the village rooftops against the fiery sky. There was a tranquillity to the scene, and yet, in the depths of her mind, thoughts still stirred, refusing to be soothed by the peace of the evening. The case of the amber brooch had been unravelled, its dark threads carefully teased apart, but there was always something that lingered after such events. Something about the fragility of human relationships, the ease with which trust could be broken, and how greed and jealousy could twist even the gentlest souls. She thought of Harriet Blackwell, walking alone now among her roses, her future uncertain, her past forever marked by her aunt's cruel end. She thought of Mr. Pembroke, now in custody, a man undone by his own ambition and desperation, and she thought, too, of those who had nothing to do with the crime, but whose lives had still been touched and altered. Mrs. Banbury, forever changed in her view of the world, and young Thomas, who had discovered his employer's body and would never forget the shock of that moment. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the faint scent of lilac from the garden, and with it memories of her own youth, of a time when life seemed simpler, though perhaps it never truly had been. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, her eyes softening as she reflected. People are so complicated, she thought, and yet so very much the same. One might hope that age would bring wisdom, that love would triumph over selfishness. But again and again we see that pride, fear and greed are always there, lurking in the hearts of even the most respectable folk. She set her teacup down carefully on its saucer, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. A small smile touched her lips, not one of amusement, but of understanding. "It is as I always say," she mused silently. "Human nature is much like my garden. Beautiful on the surface, but beneath the roses one must always beware the thorns." As the sky deepened to twilight, the first stars began to prick the heavens, tiny points of light in a darkening world, and Miss Marple sat quietly, watching them, knowing that while one mystery was solved, life in St. Mary Mead would continue. With all its small joys, secret sorrows, and perhaps future puzzles to untangle. For a woman who understood human nature as she did, there would always be something to observe, something to learn, and when the time came, another secret to uncover. As the last light faded and the lamplight bathed her room in a warm, golden glow, Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more. The familiar click of needles was comforting, steady, a rhythm against the chaos of life. And so she sat, calm and thoughtful, as night gently embraced St. Mary Mead. Chapter 18. Reflections over Tea. It was a quiet afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the kind of tranquil day where the clinking of teacups and the hum of bees were the only sounds that filled the air. The aftermath of the scandal surrounding Maurice Hargreaves' murder had begun to settle, though the ripples of gossip still stirred in every corner of the village. In her neatly kept sitting room, Miss Marple sat by the window, a fine china cup in hand, as she sipped her tea with the calmness of someone who had long known the complexities of human nature. Opposite her sat Colonel Melchett, who had come under the pretence of returning a book, but clearly wanted the comfort of Miss Marple's quiet company after the storm that had passed. "I must say, Miss Marple," he began, adjusting his spectacles, "you've done us all quite a service. The whole business with young Emily and that cursed Brooch. I don't know how you managed to see so, clearly where others, well, don't." Miss Marple smiled gently, stirring her tea with delicate precision. "Oh, Colonel, I dare say it's not so much seeing as remembering. People are much the same, you know, whether in London or here in St. Mary Mead. The way they betray themselves, a glance, a word too quickly spoken, or a trinket like that brooch, all tell a story if one knows how to listen." Colonel Melchett huffed, though not without affection. "Still, I suppose we're lucky you listen as well as you do. Never thought such violence could touch our quiet village, though I suppose I should have known better." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Evil can grow in the most unexpected places, Colonel. Sometimes right in the midst of roses and lace curtains. People think wickedness wears a dark cloak, but far more often it's hidden behind a pleasant smile or a kind word." There was a moment of silence as they both reflected on what had passed. The arrest of Mr. Withers had caused a stir, and though the truth had come to light, the shock of betrayal still lingered in the village air. "And poor Emily," Colonel Melchett said after a pause. "What will become of her now?" Miss Marple looked out the window at the garden, her face softening. "She is young," she said quietly, "young and perhaps wiser now. She will need time, but I believe she shall recover. People do, Colonel, if given patience and kindness. And she has her aunt, Mrs. Weatherby, to care for her, a woman with sense, though often hidden beneath her chatter." The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, and Miss Marple rose gracefully to refill their cups. "More tea, Colonel?" she asked with a small smile. "Gladly, Miss Marple. Your tea is the best in the village." As she poured, Miss Marple's gaze softened, but remained keen. There was always a watchfulness in her manner, as though she could see the threads of human nature weaving themselves into patterns others missed. "Do you know," she said thoughtfully, "I was thinking just now of how easily things might have gone wrong. If that little amber brooch hadn't been found, if no one had noticed Emily's anxiety when she first mentioned Maurice." Colonel Melchett nodded grimly. "Yes. Well, it's a good thing you were there to notice." Miss Marple set the teapot down gently. "It's simply that I've known many Emilys in my time, Colonel, and many Mr. Withers types too, charming on the surface, but carrying darkness underneath. People show you who they are, if you know how, to look." Colonel Melchett smiled at her, shaking his head. "If I had half your understanding of people, Miss Marple, I'd be twice the man I am." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Oh, nonsense, Colonel. You do quite well. Besides, not everyone should go poking about in things better left alone. But sometimes when one sees a young girl like Emily walking straight into danger, well, one must do something, don't you think? Indeed, Miss Marple, indeed." As the afternoon sun cast long golden rays across the room, they sat in companionable silence, sipping tea and enjoying the peace that had been so hard won. Outside, the village life carried on, Mrs. Weatherby could be seen walking her little terrier along the lane, while Mr. Pritchard, the grocer, paused to chat with Mrs. Bellamy at the post office. Life in St. Mary Mead would return to its gentle rhythm, though beneath its quiet surface the memory of the case. And Miss Marple's subtle triumph would linger. Finally, as Colonel Melchett rose to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you again, Miss Marple. You've done a great deal of good, whether anyone realizes it or not." Miss Marple merely smiled and nodded, watching him go. And as she returned to her seat and picked up her knitting once more, she murmured softly to herself, "Human nature, Colonel. It never changes, does it? But perhaps that's why one must always keep one's eyes open, even in a quiet village like ours." The needles clicked rhythmically as she worked, the sun warming her little sitting room, and all seemed right, for now. In St. Mary Mead, Chapter 19, Tea, Gossip, and Unfinished Stories. It was a week after the shocking revelation at the vicarage, and though the truth of Henry Whitlock's murder had finally come to light, the village of St. Mary Mead was far from quiet. If anything, the affair had rekindled a fierce undercurrent of gossip, spreading like wildfire from the grocer's to the post office. Miss Marple sat peacefully in her rose-scented garden, a pot of tea steaming beside her, a small plate of scones within reach, and her knitting laid gently across her lap. Her eyes wandered across the delicate petals of a climbing clematis, but her ears, as always, were alert to every sound and word drifting from the nearby lane. From beyond the hedge, the deep, familiar voices of Mrs. Hartnell and Mrs. Price Ridley floated in. "Well, I never! To think it was Mr. Harwood all along!" Mrs. Hartnell exclaimed. "I always thought there was something peculiar about him," Mrs. Price Ridley said, in her usual tone of satisfied superiority. "Though I must say that poor Emily, I never suspected her to be mixed up in such dreadful things. Poor girl!" Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, her blue eyes twinkling slightly. How quickly people rearranged their memories to suit the new truth. Only a week ago these very ladies had speculated with the utmost certainty that Emily might have had her reasons. "Of course," Mrs. Hartnell continued, "it does make you wonder, doesn't it? About people, I mean. What goes on behind closed doors? Why, I was saying to Mr. Hartnell only this morning, you never can tell." Miss Marple's lips quirked in the faintest of smiles. If anyone knew that to be true, it was she. She glanced down at her knitting and worked a few neat stitches before pausing to pour herself more tea. The sound of footsteps on the garden path made her glance up. It was Emily, looking much improved since the harrowing ordeal. There was a lightness to her step that had been absent for years, and though her face still bore traces of sorrow, there was also a glimmer of something else, hope, perhaps. "Miss Marple, I do hope I'm not disturbing you," Emily said, stopping shyly by the garden gate. "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly. "Do come in. Sit with me a while." Emily accepted the invitation and settled into the chair opposite, gazing at the neat rows of flowers with a sigh of admiration. "It's peaceful here," Emily murmured. "I don't think I've known peace for some time." Miss Marple poured tea for her, watching her over the rim of the teapot. "It's often in the quietest places that the most violent storms brew," she said gently. But storms pass, Emily. They always do. Emily looked down at her cup. I suppose I never really thanked you properly, Miss Marple, she said, her voice soft, for seeing what no one else could. Miss Marple smiled, brushing the words aside. Oh, I dare say anyone could have seen it, if they'd spent as much time noticing people as I have, she said. It's remarkable what one can learn simply by observing how people behave when they think no one is watching. There was a thoughtful silence between them as bees hummed lazily among the flowers. What will you do now, my dear? Miss Marple asked kindly. Emily hesitated, but then her face grew resolute. I think I'll start anew. Maybe visit my sister in Cornwall. I haven't seen her in years. It's time, I think, to live again. Miss Marple patted her hand. Very wise, and Cornwall is beautiful this time of year. As Emily stood to leave, she turned and asked, Do you think people ever truly change, Miss Marple? Miss Marple looked thoughtfully into the distance before replying, No, my dear. I think people don't change so much as they reveal what was always there, beneath the surface. But sometimes, she added with a twinkle, sometimes they surprise even themselves with the good that's in them. Emily smiled softly and left, walking down the path toward the village. Left alone, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her thoughts were already turning, as they often did, to the curious ways of human nature. Suddenly, from across the lane, young Leonard, the vicar's nephew, ran up to the garden fence, breathless and excited. Miss Marple! Miss Marple! You won't believe it. Someone's stolen Mrs. Bantry's silver teapot, right from under her nose. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. Really? She murmured, her mind already ticking away. Well now, how very curious. With a faint smile, she set her knitting aside and reached for her gloves. Perhaps, Leonard, we ought to go and see what all the fuss is about, don't you think? And as they walked together toward a new puzzle unfolding in St. Mary Mead, the glint of satisfaction in Miss Marple's eyes suggested that though one mystery had been solved, there were always others waiting just around the corner. Chapter 20. Reflections in the twilight evening had fallen over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden hue across the village rooftops, and as twilight deepened, the shadows grew long and soft against the neat gardens and winding lanes. In her sitting room, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, a small lamp casting a warm glow over the lace doilies and well-thumbed books that filled her cosy space. The tea-tray had been cleared away, her knitting put aside for the night. She sat with her hands folded gently in her lap, watching as the last colours of the sunset faded into dusky blue. It had been a week since Harwood's arrest and the exposure of the tangled secrets behind Henry Whitlock's death. Life had slowly begun to return to its usual rhythm in the village, though here and there a lingering whisper or speculative glance betrayed that not all minds had moved on. Miss Marple's own thoughts wandered quietly over the events of the past weeks. The curious glances, the half-spoken fears, the motives buried under years of resentment. So many little things had gone unnoticed by others. A glance, a hesitation, a word spoken too quickly, but not by her. People are much the same wherever you go, she thought, her eyes softening as they rested on a photograph of a younger Miss Marple, standing beside a beloved cousin long gone. Oh, they like to think they are very complicated, but they give themselves away in the smallest things. The amber brooch, now safely returned to its rightful place with Emily, had been the key to unravelling everything. Such a small, beautiful object. And yet it had held within it the power to expose a killer. As she sat in thought, the church bells chimed the hour, their mellow tones carrying gently through the night air. There was a tap at the door, and for a moment Miss Marple wondered who might be calling so late. Rising with the grace of long habit, she opened the door to find the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, standing there, cheeks flushed from walking briskly in the cool evening air. "Oh, Miss Marple, I do hope I'm not disturbing you," Mrs. Clement said, stepping inside as Miss Marple gestured her in. "But I just had to say how grateful we all are for what you did. I don't think anyone could have seen through it all as you did." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile and led her to sit near the fire. "It was nothing really," Miss Marple said softly. "I merely watched and listened. Things have a way of becoming clear when one does that." Mrs. Clement shook her head in admiration. "Still, I do wonder. How did you know about Harwood? Everyone was so sure it was poor Emily, and even I. Well, I had my doubts about her." Miss Marple took a moment to reply, her gaze thoughtful. "You see, my dear, when you have lived as long as I have, you come to recognize certain things. Mr. Harwood was too quick to shift suspicion, too eager to present himself as a man of simple concerns. People who have truly nothing to hide don't behave that way." She sipped her tea before continuing, her tone gentle but firm. "And then there was the way he looked at the brooch, not with fondness or sorrow, but with fear. I have always believed that guilt makes itself known in the smallest expressions." Mrs. Clement listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. "You always say that, Miss Marple, about watching people. But I must admit, I never see half of what you do." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Oh, but you will, my dear. You are still young yet. Give it time." There was a companionable silence as the fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Finally, Mrs. Clement rose to leave, gathering her shawl about her shoulders. "Well, I must go. The vicar will be wondering where I've gone, but I do hope we won't be needing your particular talents again any time soon, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled, seeing her to the door. "Yes, my dear. And yet," she added, her eyes twinkling ever so slightly, "in a village like ours, one never quite knows, does one?" As Mrs. Clement walked off into the night, Miss Marple stood for a moment on the doorstep, the cool evening breeze stirring, the leaves in her garden. She looked up at the moon glowing softly above, and with a final small smile, turned back inside to her quiet sitting-room. With her chair pulled close to the fire, she picked up her knitting once more, her sharp mind still quietly turning over the intricacies of human nature. For though one mystery had been solved, she knew well that life had a way of offering more puzzles to those who cared to see them. And Miss Marple always cared to see. Chapter 21. The Quiet Watcher of St. Mary Mead. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the early spring sun casting golden light over St. Mary Mead. Birdsong drifted through the air, and the village seemed at last to have shaken off the shadow that had hung over it since Henry Whitlock's death. From her garden, Miss Marple sat on a small bench near her rose bushes, pruning shears resting on her lap, though she seemed to have forgotten them in her thoughts. Robins hopped nearby, pecking at the ground, and the sweet scent of hyacinths filled the morning breeze. She gazed out across the green fields, her sharp blue eyes softening as they took in the peaceful scene. Yet, as always, there was a knowing look behind her gentle expression, as if she saw far more than flowers and sunlight. "Human nature," Miss Marple murmured to herself, half smiling. "Such a peculiar thing. One can know a person for years and never truly know them, until something stirs beneath the surface." She thought of Emily Whitlock, a woman whom many had dismissed as fragile and lost in mourning, yet who had shown strength and dignity when her name had been cleared, and of Harold Whitlock, whose death had seemed so ordinary at first, and yet had revealed a web of greed and betrayal. "It is the smallest things that give people away," she reflected, clipping absently at a rose stem. A glance, a word, a sudden fear in the eyes. Much like a garden, things grow hidden beneath the surface until they break through when you least expect. From across the street, young Lucy Hargrave passed by, carrying a basket of groceries, and she paused to wave to Miss Marple, her face bright with the relief of life returning to normal. Miss Marple returned the wave kindly, watching as Lucy disappeared down the lane. Poor girl, Miss Marple thought, caught up in something she had no part in, yet forever marked by it. But perhaps in time people will forget. She rose carefully, brushing off her skirt, and wandered down to the edge of the garden path, leaning slightly on her walking stick. There she gazed over the low stone wall that bordered her cottage, observing the quiet world she knew so well. Though the villagers often saw a sweet elderly lady who liked her tea and her roses, Miss Marple knew better. There are patterns too, people, she thought, just as there are patterns to the seasons, to the turning of the earth, and if one watches long enough, listens carefully enough, those patterns become quite clear. A small smile played at her lips. People forget that the world, even in a place like St. Mary Mead, is never quite as peaceful as it seems. From the direction of the village green, she could hear the distant clatter of a milk cart and the soft murmur of voices in the shop. Life was continuing, as it always did, but she knew that beneath the surface new secrets might already be stirring, as they always had and always would. And when they do, she thought quietly, her eyes glinting with quiet resolve, I shall be ready to see them. With that, Miss Marple turned and walked slowly back to her cottage, the morning sun warming her back. She paused a moment on the threshold, glancing over her shoulder at the village she knew so intimately. Yes, she murmured aloud to no one in particular, I shall always be ready. And as the door clicked gently shut behind her, the village of St. Mary Mead continued on, its gardens blooming, its people chatting, and its secrets waiting quietly to be found. The end.